The Catholic Church will exorcise you for free. Completely free. No fee, no invoice, no appointment charge. That is official policy, stated out loud. And that is exactly why exorcism became a market worth preying on. Because the moment the real thing costs nothing, and almost nobody on earth is licensed to give it to you, a second economy grows in the gap. One that will bill a frightened family $2,000 for a prayer. This isn't a story about demons. It's a story about a locked door, and everyone selling copies of the key. Let me put a face on it before we touch a single number. A man in Germany was told a priest would fly in to help his family. Something was wrong in their home, something they couldn't name, and a voice on the other end of a screen promised to make it stop. He wired the money, $2,000. The priest never existed. The page was a costume, stitched together from a stolen photo and a borrowed collar. Now hold that against one plain fact. The actual church would have done it for nothing. Would have sent a real priest, said the real prayers, and never once mentioned money. So the German man didn't pay for an exorcism. He paid for the appearance of authority, the confidence that the person praying over his family had the right to. And that, quietly, is the most expensive thing in this entire world. Not the ritual, the permission to perform it. So here is the thesis, and I want to say it cleanly, because everything after this is just the machinery underneath it. You think exorcism is a ritual. A man in black, some Latin, holy water, a struggle you can feel in your chest. It is that. But underneath the ritual is a market, and the product being sold in that market is not the prayer at all. The product is a ruling, a verdict. Someone, somewhere, has to decide that you are genuinely possessed, and someone else has to be certified as allowed to act on it. Control those two decisions, and you don't control a ceremony. You control who gets to suffer legitimately, and who gets to help them. The need underneath is one of the oldest we have. When a person you love changes, goes dark, goes strange, stops being themselves, you will do almost anything to get them back. That desperation is real, and it is not stupid. And I'm not going to spend 20 minutes sneering at people in the worst moment of their lives. But desperation is also the purest fuel a market can run on. It doesn't shop around. It doesn't ask for a receipt. And whoever holds the authority to answer it holds something close to absolute leverage. And here's why the authority matters more than the ritual, which sounds strange until you see it. Anyone can say the words. The prayers exist in books. You could read them aloud tonight. What you cannot do is make them count. The power was never in the syllables, it was in the collective agreement that this person, blessed by that office, saying those words, is doing something real, while the identical words from your mouth are just noise. That agreement is the entire product. It's invisible, it's social, and it can be built up over centuries, or faked in an afternoon with a stolen photo. The whole rest of this story is just the fight over who gets to own that agreement and who gets to sell counterfeits of it. So let's define the product precisely, because exorcism is a fog and the money hides in the fog. There are roughly 3 things being sold under that one word, and they are not the same thing at all. The first is the diagnosis. Before any prayer, a judgment has to be made. Is this person possessed, or are they ill? The Church's own rulebook, the Rite, was codified in the Rituale Romanum back in 1614, and quietly rewritten in 1999 is obsessed with this question. It insists on signs, on caution, on ruling out the medical first. That caution is genuine. It is also, economically, the gate. Because whoever gets to say, yes, this is real, is the person who converts an ordinary frightened family into a customer with a legitimate claim. And the signs it looks for are strangely specific. The old manual names things like speaking in languages the person never learned, knowing hidden or distant things they couldn't know, and a strength far beyond their body plus a deep physical aversion to anything sacred. Read as theology, it's a checklist for the presence of evil. Read as economics, it's something colder. a set of admission criteria, a test you can pass or fail. And because the test is subjective, interpreted case by a human being, the person holding the checklist holds the power to decide whose crisis is spiritual and whose is merely medical. That decision, more than any prayer, is the first thing of value that changes hands. The second thing being sold is the license, not the prayer, the right to say it. And this is where the scarcity lives. Under church law, the solemn rite of exorcism can't just be performed by any priest who feels called to it. It requires express, individual permission from the local bishop, granted only to a priest judged to have piety, knowledge, prudence, and integrity of life. Read that again, because it is the whole engine. The prayer is free. The permission to say the prayer is rationed by a single office, one bishop at a time. The third thing, and this is the one people actually chase, is legitimacy itself. The feeling that the person helping you is the real thing and not a man in a costume. That feeling has no fixed price, which means in the wrong hands it has every price. It's worth whatever fear will pay. 3 products: a diagnosis, a license, and legitimacy. Keep them separate in your head because the money behaves completely differently around each one. Now follow the money, or rather, follow where the money refuses to go, because that absence is the most important number in this whole story. Inside the official system, the price is 0. And I don't mean cheap. I mean the institution has drawn a hard line and stood on it. Just last year, the association that represents these exorcists put out a statement so blunt, it almost reads like a warning label. The ministry must be free, unrelated to any monetary offering, and no one seeking help should ever feel obliged to pay. Free is a policy. Free is enforced. Free is the brand, which sounds on the surface like the opposite of an economy. No transaction, no market, right? Wrong, and this is the part that took me a while to see. A price of 0 on the official product doesn't kill the market. It relocates it. When the legitimate version costs nothing but is almost impossible to access, the value doesn't vanish. It pulls up behind the locked door as pure, unmet demand. And demand that can't be met legitimately gets met some other way. Look at the scale of that trapped demand. One Italian priest, speaking a few years ago, claimed requests had tripled in just a few years, and put the number at something like 500,000 cases a year in Italy alone. Hold that figure loosely. I'll come back to why it's shakier than it sounds, but even a fraction of it is a tidal wave. Now set it against supply. In the entire United States, one bishop once said he could think of maybe 5 or 6 working exorcists. 5 or 6. For a country of hundreds of millions. Sit inside that ratio for a second, because that's the whole business. An ocean of frightened people on one side, a door held shut by a handful of keys on the other. The official price is 0, but the official supply is almost 0 too, and the space between those 2 zeros is where every dollar in this story gets made. Not by the church. By everyone standing in the gap the church left open, and the key holders noticed each other. Back in the 1980s, the whole field was scattered a handful of priests doing lonely work in separate dioceses. Then they organized. The association that eventually formed started with something like 40 members. By 2017, it had passed 500. Well over 100 of them lay assistants rather than priests, with the largest concentration a couple hundred clustered in Italy. Watch what that is. Structurally, it's a guild, a professional body forming around a scarce license, doing exactly what guilds have always done, setting standards, sharing knowledge, and crucially, drawing a firm line between who is inside the trade and who is merely claiming to be. A guild doesn't just serve its members. It defines the boundary of the legitimate, and the sharper that boundary gets, the more valuable it becomes to stand on the right side of it. Here's where it flips, and here's where I have to be honest with you in a way that complicates my own story. You'd assume the margin sits with the fakes, the Facebook priests, the $2,000 wire transfers. And some of it does. We'll get there. But the real concentration of power isn't the money at all. It's the authority. And the authority is held, tightly and deliberately, by the institution that charges nothing. Think about what that bishop's permission actually is. It's a bottleneck, and bottlenecks are the most valuable real estate in any economy. By keeping the license scarce, one office, individual approval, a short list of trusted names, the church doesn't make money in the vulgar sense. It makes something better than money. It makes itself the definition of real. Every imposter, every gray market healer, every late-night deliverance stream is, whether they admit it or not, borrowing against that definition. They are all knockoffs of a brand they can never legally carry. The church captures the margin not in cash but in monopoly. The monopoly on the word genuine. And there's even an academy for it now. Since 2004, there's been a formal course in Rome at a pontifical university that trains and credentials people in this ministry. When it started, it was the first of its kind, the idea that this work should be taught with rigor rather than passed down in whispers. And look at what sits on the syllabus. Theology and liturgy, yes, but right beside them, psychiatry, neurology, pharmacology, forensics, and law. Hundreds of people pass through it. Priests, bishops, doctors, canon lawyers, from all over the world. That course is the factory floor of legitimacy. It's where the scarce thing gets manufactured, carefully, on purpose. And notice the genius of putting psychiatry in the same room as the rite. It lets the institution say, with total sincerity, that it takes medicine seriously while never surrendering the final ruling to the doctors. The church absorbs the skeptic's tools into its own training and comes out the other side looking more credible, not less. That's not a trick. It's just what a durable authority does. It eats its critics' best arguments and wears them as proof of its own seriousness. But now the self-puncture. Because a clean story is usually a lie. If the whole engine is authority, you'd expect the authorities themselves to be certain. They're not. And the most devastating admission doesn't come from a skeptic, it comes from the most famous exorcist who ever lived. This man claimed to have performed more than 160,000 exorcisms over his career. An astonishing, almost impossible number, and we should be suspicious of it. Because it's the kind of figure that becomes a brand. But here's what he also said, near the end. Of all those cases, the overwhelming majority, by his own estimate, around 98%, really needed a psychiatrist, not a priest. Of the tens of thousands he prayed over, he thought only around 100 were true possession. Sit with that. The single most authoritative voice in the field spent a career telling people, in effect, that the product they came for was almost never the thing they actually needed. That is not a gotcha. It's the opposite of a scam. It's a man guarding the gate honestly. But it detonates the neat version of this story. Because if the real experts say possession is vanishingly rare, then the enormous demand pressing against that locked door is mostly pain that got the wrong label. And a market built on a scarce, misapplied label is a very dangerous thing to leave lying around. So, what threatens this system? What could destabilize a machine that runs on scarce authority and free official pricing? The first threat is the one we've been circling, the counterfeit. When the genuine article is free but unreachable, imitation becomes wildly profitable. The scarcity that makes the church's authority valuable is the exact same scarcity that makes faking it lucrative. Those fake priest pages, the stolen collars, the wired money, they aren't a glitch in the system. They are the predictable overflow of it. Build a dam that high and water finds the cracks. The second threat is competition from an entirely different faith economy. The Italian priest who claimed demand had tripled blamed something specific. People drifting first to fortune tellers, tarot readers, the whole loose bazaar of the occult, and arriving at the church's door already frightened, already spent, already convinced something had its hooks in them. In other words, a rival industry upstream is manufacturing the very demand the church then has to absorb for free, while the fortune tellers got paid on the way in. The third threat is the quietest and the most corrosive: psychiatry. Every year that mental health care gets better at explaining the strange, the dark, the not yourself, the diagnostic gate gets harder to defend. When the most honest exorcists themselves are sending 98 out of 100 people to a doctor, the product's own experts are shrinking its market. This is a system whose most credible practitioners are, by their own honesty, talking themselves out of business and holding the line anyway. But here's the twist the neat version misses, and I want to be fair to it. Psychiatry hasn't actually collapsed the demand. If anything, demand has grown in the same decades that mental health care has expanded. Why? Because a medical diagnosis gives you a name, but it doesn't always give you meaning. This is a chemical imbalance, explains the mechanism, and leaves the ache untouched. A ritual, for the people who believe in it, offers something a prescription can't: a story where the darkness has a face, and a face can be fought. So psychiatry threatens the diagnosis, but not the hunger underneath it. The two aren't really competing for the same thing. One treats the brain, the other answers the question the brain can't: why me, and what does this mean? As long as that second question exists, the market survives no matter how good the medicine gets. So who wins here? And who pays? And this is the beat where I stop saying you, because from here on the seat you're sitting in isn't a customer's, it's a witness's. The institution wins, but not in the way a cynic wants it to. It wins authority, not cash. By giving the ritual away and rationing the right to perform it, it becomes the fixed point everyone else orbits the standard, the real, the thing counterfeiters are forced to imitate. That's a genuine kind of power, and it's worth being clear-eyed that holding it also lets the institution decide whose suffering is spiritually legitimate and whose is merely medical. That is enormous social power, quietly held, mostly given away for free. The exorcists themselves, the real, licensed ones, mostly don't win at all in any material sense. Many describe the work as isolating, exhausting, unpaid, and frightening. The famous ones become brands, and brands attract money and movies. But the ordinary licensed priest doing this at 2 a.m. is not getting rich. If anything, he's the least compensated worker in the entire chain. The middlemen win. The credentialing courses, the handbook publishers, the conference circuit, the associations, the whole apparatus that surrounds the scarce license and sells access, training, and belonging to it. They don't sell exorcisms. They sell proximity to legitimacy, and proximity is always for sale. And notice how clean this is. None of it is fraud. A course fee, a book, a conference badge, every one of those is a real thing honestly exchanged. The apparatus doesn't have to lie. It just has to sit next to something scarce and charge admission to the waiting room. The counterfeiters win too, at least for a while. And their cleverness is worth studying because it tells you where the value really sits. The smartest of them don't invent authority from nothing. They borrow the real thing. One scheme charged people $300 just to book an appointment, then quietly funneled them toward an actual parish that would have seen them for free. Read that carefully. The scammer added nothing. No ritual, no service, no risk. They simply installed a toll booth in front of a door that was already open and charged for the illusion that the door was locked. That is the purest possible expression of this entire economy. Money extracted not for the thing, but for standing between you and the thing. And then the casualties. The counterfeiters' victims, the German family, the people charged $300 for an appointment that led nowhere. The vulnerable talked out of thousands. They pay in money. But the deeper casualties pay in something worse. They are the ones whose real illness got read as a demon, who were prayed over when they needed treatment, who lost months or years to the wrong label because the wrong door opened first. The scarce authority system, at its cruelest, doesn't just overcharge. It misdirects, and the bill for a misdirection like that isn't measured in dollars. So where does that leave us? Two truths, and you have to hold them both, because dropping either one turns this into propaganda. The first truth: the need is real. The fear of watching someone you love turn into a stranger is one of the most human things there is, and the ritual that answers it is old and serious, and for the people inside that faith, genuinely meant. Nobody honest gets to laugh at that. The free official rite, hard as it is to reach, is at least trying to give something away that the frightened world is desperate to buy. The second truth: scarce authority is a machine whether anyone intends it to be or not. Ration, the right to say who's possessed and who's allowed to help, price the real thing at zero, and you will, with the reliability of physics, generate a shadow economy of counterfeits, middlemen, and misdirected pain around the edges of it. Not because the institution is greedy, often precisely because it isn't, because it refuses to charge, and that refusal leaves the gap wide open for everyone who will. And notice that this pattern isn't really about religion at all. Anywhere a society makes one thing precious and hard to reach, a diagnosis, a license, a credential, a stamp that says genuine, the same three shadows appear: the guild that guards it, the academy that sells the path to it, and the counterfeiter who fakes it for the desperate who can't wait. Exorcism just shows the mechanism in its rawest form, because the stakes are a human soul and the official price is nothing. Strip away the Latin and the holy water, and what's left is a truth about every gate ever built. The person who controls the gate rarely needs to charge you. They only need to make sure there's no other way through. So the next time you see the collar, the Latin, the water, the struggle watch, the ritual if you like, but follow the authority. Ask who got to decide this was real, and who was licensed to answer it, and who was standing in the gap between the free thing and the unreachable thing, holding out a hand and a price tag. The demon was never the expensive part. The permission was.